1 year ago, white smoke broke above St. Peter's Square, and the papacy shifted into a new American era without warning or preparation. Robert Francis Prevost of Chicago stepped onto the balcony, a missionary formed in Peru, an Augustinian friar known more for obedience than visibility, now Pope Leo XIV. Inside minutes, the question spread through Rome with a quiet pressure that felt institutional rather than emotional. Is this pope actually changing the church, or simply walking through changes already set in motion before him? What most people did not see was how little of the system belonged to him at the start. A Jubilee year already running, schedules already locked, documents already circulating, and a church still adjusting to the absence of Francis. That inherited structure reached its final frame on January 6, 2026, when the Holy Door of St. Peter's Basilica was closed and the Jubilee officially ended. The next morning, Leo XIV called 170 cardinals into Rome, and the tone of the pontificate began to shift from continuation into authorship. The first shift does not arrive through doctrine or proclamation, but through the structure of governance inside the College of Cardinals. For more than a decade, decision-making had been filtered through smaller advisory circles, leaving many cardinals physically present in the church, but functionally distant from its center of gravity. That imbalance had been noted quietly in different regions, described less as rebellion and more as absence. Leo XIV responds by reversing the pattern without announcing a rupture. In January 2026, he calls 170 cardinals into an extraordinary consistory in Rome, a 2-day session built on open discussion and structured exchange. The significance is not the gathering itself, but the redistribution of voice inside it. A second assembly is later established on a biannual rhythm, embedding the college back into the operational heartbeat of governance rather than leaving it at the perimeter. The same morning rhythm carries into a second decision that shifts from administration into memory itself. During the weekly general audience on January 7th, Leo XIV announces a systematic return to the documents of the Second Vatican Council. The instruction is not symbolic reflection but structured teaching, delivered week after week with direct engagement with the original texts. 14 catecheses are already completed, moving through doctrinal foundations that define modern Catholic identity. The reasoning behind the decision points to a generational break, where lived memory of the Council has disappeared from the Church's living transmission. Without that memory, interpretation begins to replace source material, and Leo moves to reverse that drift by returning authority to the documents themselves. The Council is no longer framed as historical debate, but as active reference point guiding present governance. That return to foundations is immediately followed by a forward-facing intervention into a different kind of uncertainty. On May 15, 2026, Pope Leo XIV publishes Magnifica Humanitatis, the first papal encyclical entirely dedicated to artificial intelligence. The document does not treat technology as background development, but as a system reshaping human dignity at scale. The framing draws a direct parallel to Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum, placing digital transformation inside the same moral urgency once attached to industrial labor. In this text, artificial intelligence is described in terms of exclusion, decision-making without mercy, and structures that can deny access to work, care, and opportunity without appeal. The language shifts the focus from machines to governance systems operating through them, positioning the Church toward what he calls a new continent that must be evangelized. The first institutional signal of internal restructuring appears through 2 separate decisions affecting leadership inside Vatican governance. In November 2025, an amendment removes the requirement that the president of the Pontifical Commission for Vatican City-State must be a cardinal, opening the role to non-cardinal leadership for the first time. The change is not announced as reform language, but as procedural adjustment inside governance rules. Months later, on June 2, 2026, Maria Montserrat Alvarado is appointed prefect of the Dicastery for Communication. Her appointment marks the first time a laywoman leads a Vatican dicastery, and also makes her the youngest prefect within the Roman Curia. The shift is not framed as doctrinal development, but as redistribution of administrative authority inside communication structures controlling Vatican media networks. The papal travel pattern begins forming its own narrative structure as movements replace declarations. Leo XIV travels to Turkey and Lebanon to mark 1700 years since the Council of Nicaea, positioning the visit inside historical continuity and regional instability. He later moves to Monaco for a brief stop, followed by a 10-day journey across 4 African nations including Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. Each destination aligns with regions described internally as ecclesial peripheries, rather than central institutions. In June, he extends the itinerary to Spain and the Canary Islands, areas linked to migration routes between Africa and Europe. The Vatican confirms in February 2026 that the Pope will not visit the United States during his first year in office, a decision that reshapes expectations about national identity and papal visibility. Public positioning begins to reveal a dual structure that does not align neatly with any single political category. On doctrinal matters, his statements remain firm regarding abortion, same-sex marriage, and ordination of women, maintaining continuity with established teaching. At the same time, his interventions on immigration, war, poverty, and arms production become increasingly direct in public forums. After a school shooting in the United States, he refers to a pandemic of arms, drawing immediate attention from political observers. His remarks on wealth concentration and military conflict generate responses from political leadership, including public criticism from the United States presidency. His biographers describe this positioning as a consistent life ethic, where moral responsibility extends across birth, borders, and conflict zones without separation between categories. The question of the traditional Latin Mass becomes a controlled pressure point inside the early years of the pontificate. Traditionis Custodes remains in force and is not revoked, establishing continuity with the previous framework. At the same time, diocesan dispensations are allowed under episcopal authority, creating limited local flexibility without changing the central rule. In October 2025, Cardinal Burke is granted permission to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass at St. Peter's Basilica during the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage. The decision draws attention precisely because it is not accompanied by formal explanation or doctrinal statement. Tension escalates when the Society of St. Pius X announces plans to ordain 4 bishops without papal approval on July 1, 2026. The Vatican responds by warning that such actions would constitute schismatic acts carrying automatic excommunication. The situation shifts from theoretical dispute into scheduled confrontation with a fixed calendar date. On June 16th, Leo XIV issues a personal appeal urging them not to proceed and calling for communion within the Church. The appeal is framed as final restraint before institutional rupture, leaving the outcome dependent on a decision outside Vatican control. Within the same doctrinal boundary, a separate pastoral channel remains active through engagement with advocates for LGBTQ Catholics. A private meeting with Father James Martin is described as cordial and extended, with emphasis placed on continuity rather than reversal of teaching. Official language confirms that doctrine regarding marriage and ordination remains unchanged. At the same time, the meeting is characterized as a continuation of Francis's pastoral approach of accompaniment and dialogue. The structure creates a dual layer, where teaching remains fixed, while pastoral interaction remains open. On September 7, 2025, St. Peter's Square becomes the center of a canonization event attended by 80,000 people. 2 figures are canonized together, Pier Giorgio Frassati and Carlo Acutis, marking a generational bridge in modern Catholic identity. Carlo Acutis becomes the first millennial saint in church history. His association with digital cataloging of Eucharistic miracles introduces a new symbolic reference point for younger Catholics. The canonization is framed as a statement about holiness operating within ordinary life and modern digital culture rather than confined to historical religious forms. Over time, the early months of the pontificate begin to reveal a slower pattern of presence rather than sudden disruption. The papal schedule settles into inherited obligations, liturgical cycles, and structured audiences that continue without interruption. Instead of immediate reinvention, the rhythm reflects continuity within established Vatican systems already in motion. Observers note that major visibility moments are not driven by spontaneous gestures but by scheduled events already embedded in the calendar. The image that emerges is not acceleration, but controlled unfolding inside a long institutional timeline. Inside Vatican spaces, small behavioral details begin to shape perception more than official declarations. Reports from within the Curia describe a pope who maintains low visibility outside structured duties, avoiding unnecessary symbolic amplification. Linguistic flexibility between Spanish and English reflects his long missionary background rather than a deliberate public strategy. Even informal references to simple personal habits circulate quietly without institutional framing. These details do not change policy, but they gradually reshape how presence is experienced inside the system. By the end of the first year, the accumulation of decisions forms a structural pattern rather than isolated reforms. Governance is redistributed toward the College of Cardinals, teaching is anchored back to conciliar texts, and institutional leadership expands beyond traditional clerical boundaries. Global travel emphasizes peripheries over centers, while doctrinal positions remain stable across key moral issues. The result is a papacy defined less by doctrinal change and more by institutional reconfiguration. The central question does not resolve through a single action, but through the slow reorganization of authority, direction, and visibility inside the Church. By the end of the first year, the question that opened the pontificate no longer depends on speeches, documents, or isolated reforms. It is written into structure, into who is invited into governance, who interprets tradition, and who carries authority inside Vatican systems. Nothing has been formally overturned, yet nothing remains untouched in its original balance. The Church continues moving with its doctrines intact, but its internal weight has shifted across different centers of decision-making. What began as inheritance has slowly become authorship through accumulation rather than rupture. The image left behind is not a moment of transformation, but a sequence of controlled adjustments that never announce themselves as revolution. A closed holy door, a gathered College of Cardinals, a document on artificial intelligence, a reordered curia, and a papacy that moves more through placement than declaration. Each action remains contained on its own, yet together they redraw how authority flows through the system. The result is a church that looks unchanged from a distance, but behaves differently in motion. And the question that first spread through Rome still remains open, not answered by statement, but by structure itself.